Seems like everyone these days wants to change the Constitution. And that's not surprising because it's 238 years old and has only been amended 27 times, which might sound like a lot until you learn Americans have tried to amend it 12,000 times. That means that 99.998% of proposed amendments have failed. And as you might have learned over the last couple of years, the Constitution has some big structural problems. Single-member districts, the Electoral College, and the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court, but hey, we don't have all day. Now, some of the amendments have been good, but some of the ideas that lawmakers have tried to cram into the Constitution have ranged from mildly unhinged to, oh my god, who let this guy anywhere near a fountain pen? So today we're diving into the amendments that didn't make the cut, the proposals that went nowhere, and the ideas that were so bad that even drunk members of Congress said, nope, hard pass. Now, when Vice President Aaron Burr killed Alexander Hamilton in 1804, you would have thought that the murder would have put an end to dueling, especially after Burr escaped and then tried to crown himself the king of the Western states, which is a thing that actually happened. But Congress wouldn't put dueling out of pasture just yet. Congress didn't really get worked up about the dueling until two members of the House of Representatives killed each other. That's right, Kentucky Representative William Graves killed Maine Representative Jonathan Stilley in a duel right here at the Bladensburg Dueling Grounds just northeast of Washington, D.C. But what's crazy is these two didn't even have a direct grievance with each other. However, Graves was sent to deliver a dueling invitation from a New York newspaper editor who accused Stilley of defamation. But Graves and Stilley decided that since they were already hanging out at the dueling grounds, they should duel each other to the death because why not? What could go wrong? Well, here's what went wrong. They went beyond the customary 2 rounds, and in round 3, Graves shot Stilley dead. A funeral was held in the House of Representatives, and the Supreme Court boycotted it in protest. Although Graves and the 2 seconds, also members of Congress, were referred for censure, the House declined to punish them. In fact, nobody ever went to jail for Graves' death, just like no one ever served a prison term for killing Hamilton. So Virginia Representative William Stephen Morgan introduced House Resolution 8, which would have amended the Constitution to prohibit anyone from holding federal public office from dueling and barring anyone who took part in a duel. The resolution and constitutional amendment never passed, but the House did eventually pass a law outlawing dueling in Washington, D.C. And I guess that's why America has to celebrate its 250th birthday with an MMA fight on the White House lawn instead of J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio facing off in a duel. Now, speaking of short kings, that takes us to Napoleon Bonaparte, or specifically Jerome Bonaparte, who was the 19th century version of Prince Harry. Now, he renounced any claim to the French Empire, married an American, and settled in Maryland with a couple's son, Beau. But Jerome's wife, Elizabeth Patterson, was a lightning rod for controversy because, she existed. Now, conspiracy theorists thought that it was obvious that Elizabeth was plotting to give Beau a French title, get him elected president, and then he'd be king of America. Now, there was never any proof that a plot was afoot, but the Federalist Party, fresh off a crushing defeat in the elections of 1800, seized on the presence of a half-French baby to accuse Jeffersonian Republicans of being overly enamored with French food and French wine. They convinced a lot of people that there was trouble ahead unless America passed a constitutional amendment outlawing anyone with a noble title from serving in government. So the Federalists were as worked up about the Bonapartes as Piers Morgan was about Prince Harry and Meghan Markle today.
She's a failed actress. She's clearly acting out of bad intent. She wants to destroy things she didn't build.
And the final text of the proposed amendment would have also stripped citizenship from any American who accepted a noble title. Quote, if any citizen of the United States shall accept, claim, receive, or retain any title of nobility or honor, or shall, without consent of Congress, accept and retain any present, pension, office, or emolument of any kind whatever, from any emperor, king, prince, or foreign power, such person shall cease to be a citizen of the United States, and shall be incapable of holding any office of trust or profit under them or either of them. Now, the Jeffersonian Republicans believed there was no reason for the amendment. The Constitution already said that titles of nobility were no good in the United States. What more is there to say? But 12 states still ratified the amendment. 4 said no, and that left the amendment 1 short of ratification. Now, when Louisiana was added to the Union in 1812, the number of states needed for ratification changed again. Soon, so many states were being admitted to the Union that people had a hard time actually keeping up with what constituted 3/4 of the states. And that's when things got weird. After the British burned down the White House in the War of 1812, some records were lost, and no one was really sure which states ratified the amendment and when. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams wrote letters to several states saying basically, hey, did you guys ever pass that nobility amendment? And there was still confusion about whether Virginia ratified it, but the plot thickened when the 13th Amendment was included in an official book of laws. You can see it here on page 74 of the 1815 edition of Laws of the United States of America. Now, the printer's notes admit that they have no idea if the 13th Amendment was ratified. Quote, there's been some difficulty in ascertaining whether the amendment proposed, which is stated as the 13th, has or has not been adopted by a sufficient number of the state's legislatures. It has been considered best, however, to publish the proposed amendment in its proper place as if it had been adopted with this explanation to prevent misconception. Boy, was that a mistake. Because the printers never would have imagined that 150 years in the future, people would cite this book to prove that the missing 13th Amendment had been ratified and that the court system had zero power over them. But that's exactly what happened. Yes, the missing 13th Amendment is an integral part of the sovereign citizen movement. Now, sovereign citizens insist that the nobility amendment was ratified, and they argue that the judicial system has no jurisdiction over them because lawyers use the title Esquire. This, say the 13thers, violates the missing 13th Amendment because Esquire is a title of nobility. So, under the sovereign citizens theory, bear with me on this, lawyers, especially government prosecutors, have no jurisdiction over them in any court of law, which is pretty convenient. But the bottom line is that the missing 13th Amendment is not a real amendment, but defendants continue to cite the 1815 book. And whatever happened to Beau Bonaparte? Well, he married an American and they had 2 children, including Charles Bonaparte, a progressive politician who served as Teddy Roosevelt's attorney general. Charles Bonaparte also happened to be the founder of the FBI. So the Bonapartes clearly played the long game. Now, Congress eventually marked itself safe from baby French aristocrats, but for decades they were stymied by another major crisis: bad presidents. Now, our next group of failed amendments includes the many times that Congress spectacularly failed to ban alcohol before they finally got one to pass. But there's no way that we could fit all that into this video, so we made a whole separate video about it. But the only way you can see this exclusive video is by signing up with the sponsor of today's video, Nebula. But right now, for a limited time, you can watch it for free. And not only that, but you can also watch our entire library of content without ads for free. The only catch is that you only have 72 hours to do so. That's because Nebula is offering a 3-day trial that gives you unlimited access to everything on the platform, not just LegalEagle. So if you've ever dreamed of speedrunning a deep understanding of how our legal system works, I dare you to see how much LegalEagle content you can watch on our dime. And don't worry, you'll still get an email reminder the day before your free trial ends. But if you do decide to keep it, that's cool too, because you'll still get the exclusive LegalEagle discount by clicking on the link below or scanning the codes on screen. Because Nebula is a streaming service where you can watch all the content from your favorite creators like Jetlag, Real Engineering, Real Life Lore, and of course, LegalEagle. All ad-free and early. Plus you can watch countless Nebula exclusive videos made with love, time, and effort, and increased budgets that would be too risky on YouTube. I personally love Abolish Everything. It's an original comedy show where comedians argue to abolish everyday aspects of society against a panel who are hell-bent on preserving the status quo. It's hilariously reminiscent of what practicing law can often feel like. And at Nebula, we're in it for the longest possible term, a lifetime. And that's why with my link and code, you can also have the option to get $200 off the regular lifetime subscription rate of $500. That means that for just $300, you can start watching every LegalEagle video ad-free and early forever. In fact, every video we've made this year is an extended cut on Nebula, including more hilarious legal analysis that I did with Brendan Lee Mulligan, and the beatdown that Dr. Mike and I did on The Good Doctor. And if you use my link or code, you can get 40% off a lifetime or annual subscription. Either way, click or scan now to get set up with a free 3-day trial and continue watching LegalEagle on Nebula, or I'll see you in court. Now, when it comes to how we elect a president, a lot of people think the Constitution got it wrong. Most of the criticism is correctly directed towards the Electoral College, which was a compromise between those who wanted the president to be elected by Congress and those who wanted the president to be elected by popular vote. Now, over time, the process of selecting the president has evolved with several amendments to the Constitution and changes in state laws. Now, the Electoral College remains intact, but there have been hundreds of proposals to reform the way that we pick the president, including the idea that we should just pull a name out of a hat. You know, like Shirley Jackson's lottery? Sounds good. Yes, in 1808, Senator Hillhouse from Connecticut was discouraged by the partisan divisions that had engulfed the nation. He thought that things would be less heated if we chose the president by lot. Now, here was the plan. First, limit senators to 3 years in office. Then 1/3 of all senators would be required to retire. The retiring senators would then be entered into a lottery to become president. Hillhouse envisioned each senator dramatically drawing a ball out of a box, sort of like an NBA draft lottery, and the one who got the lucky colored ball would be named America's next top president. Now, everyone pretty much ignored the Hillhouse Amendment, but 20 years later it was revived when 2 members of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Marshall and William Crawford, endorsed the proposal. John Quincy Adams wasn't having it though. He wrote in his diary that, quote, "A serious discussion of his amendments would be ridiculous." But the Hillhouse Amendment simply would not die. In 1846, Representative Vinson of Ohio proposed his own presidential lottery. This one would function more like Eurovision. Each state would vote for their favorite candidate, and the winners of the state election would be entered into a lottery. Each state would get the number of balls corresponding to their representatives in the House and Senate, and the person whose name ended up on the winning ball would be the president. But eventually Congress decided that selecting the president by a Powerball lottery would be even dumber than the Electoral College, and that's saying something. So they turned their attention to more pressing matters, like marketing. Because after the Civil War, Congress was awash in proposals to remake the nation from the ground up. But one lawmaker had a different idea for rebuilding national unity: a full-on rebrand. In 1866, Missouri Representative George Washington Anderson suggested that the United States of America needed a sleeker, more inspiring name. Something bold, something unified. Something that sounds less like a shared lease agreement and more like a continental destiny. His answer? Drop the. Just Facebook. No, I'm just kidding. Drop the United States. Just call the whole thing America. And according to Anderson, the existing name wasn't, quote, sufficiently comprehensive and significant to indicate the real unity and destiny of the American people as the eventual paramount power of this hemisphere. So basically, he wanted a geopolitical glow-up, a national vibes overhaul. This was the 19th century equivalent of hiring a branding agency to optimize the logo for synergy. To Anderson, America captured the grandeur of a rising post-war nation. To everyone else, it sounded like he was trying to trademark two continents. And across the Atlantic, the Illustrated London News roasted the idea as the verbal appropriation of a hemisphere, which is Victorian English for, oh, get over yourselves. Congress also declined to take the proposal seriously. After all, changing the nation's name would have required revising nearly every law, treaty, letterhead, and coin in circulation. Plus, legislators had slightly more pressing problems at the time, like, Reconstruction, civil rights, and figuring out how to let these seceded states back into the club without everyone murdering each other. But of course, fast forward to 2025, a year when we don't have any serious problems that need our attention, and that's how the body of water, long known as the Gulf of Mexico, is putatively called the Gulf of America. At least according to the President of the United States. But America has always been expansionist, so perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that some people thought the US should rule the whole world. So in 1893, Wisconsin House Representative Lucas Miller introduced an amendment resolution in Congress that would rename the country the United States of Earth. Now, Miller's resolution explained that, quote, it is possible for the republic to grow through the admission of new states into the Union until every nation on Earth has become part of it. But not surprising, the Lucas Amendment was even more widely ridiculed and it promptly fell flat on its face. And voters sent Lucas packing after just one term. But eventually, representatives started focusing on more important things, like rich people. In the depths of the Great Depression, when bread lines stretched around city blocks and entire states were living on emergency relief, Congress briefly flirted with one of the most radical economic ideas in American history, a constitutional amendment that would have capped personal wealth at $1 million. Now, adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $23 million today. Still a large amount, but a rounding error for the modern billionaire. But in 1933, though, this wasn't satire or a protest slogan. It was a serious legislative proposal with real backing on Capitol Hill. The proposed amendment came from Representative Wesley Lloyd of Washington, a New Deal Democrat who thought America's concentration of wealth was a threat to democracy itself. That's silly. But his reasoning was blunt. A nation where millions had nothing and a tiny elite controlled almost everything was a nation courting collapse. And with unemployment above 20% and banks failing weekly, the idea didn't seem that outlandish. Now, the text of the amendment was simple. It would have limited any individual's total wealth to $1 million, and any surplus had to be surrendered to the federal government. No offshore accounts, no clever asset games, no dynastic hoarding. If you cross the cap, the Treasury got what spilled over. And in other words, America would still allow private wealth, but not unlimited private empires. Now, not only did the wealth cap not pass, but now we have at least one billionaire in Congress, West Virginia Senator Jim Justice. But it's not just concentration of wealth that poses a problem. Some people have long believed that the office of the president has accumulated way too much power. Not anyone in the current Supreme Court, but in the aftermath of the Civil War and the chaos of Reconstruction, Congress briefly entertained one of the strangest constitutional rewrites in American history, a proposal to abolish the single presidency altogether and replace it with a three-person executive council, basically a modern Roman triumvirate. And its supporters saw the amendment as a cure for what they saw as the fatal flaw in the American system: too much power in one pair of hands. And the proposal emerged from a deep distrust of the executive authority that had been building for years. Abraham Lincoln had suspended habeas corpus, Andrew Johnson had been impeached, Ulysses S. Grant's administration was mired in corruption scandals, and as the disputed election of 1876 loomed, the fear that the president could seize illegitimate power felt dangerously real. And under the proposed amendment, the presidency would be replaced by a council of three co-equal executives, elected either nationally or regionally, who would share all of the constitutional powers of the office. Commander-in-chief authority, veto power, appointments, the whole package. And nothing could happen without majority agreement among the three. Its supporters argued that Rome had used triumvirates for centuries, so really, what could go wrong? Well, if you know history, a lot. A lot could go wrong. Rome's triumvirates ended in civil war pretty much every time. So not surprisingly, the amendment never made it out of committee. And by early 1877, Reconstruction had ended and there was no real appetite for radical change. But speaking of executives having too much power, many presidents think that they have the power to wage war whenever they want to. But really, it's Congress that has sole constitutional authority to declare war. But in the early 20th century, populist politicians thought the American people should have direct say in whether the nation sent them to war or not. Between 1916 and 1940, Congressman Louis Ludlow of Indiana championed an amendment that would have made a national referendum legally required before the U.S. could declare war. The logic was simple. If the decision could cost millions of lives, then everyone should have a direct vote on it. Now, Ludlow was not alone in thinking this way. World War I had disillusioned a generation. By the 1930s, America had a powerful isolationist movement, and Ludlow's solution was that before Congress could declare war, the question would have to go to the voters in a nationwide referendum. No referendum, no war. Proponents argued that this would prevent unnecessary conflicts and respect the consent of the governed. And for years, the proposal gained real traction. In the mid-1930s, Ludlow's amendments came within a whisker of passing the House of Representatives, but the amendment stumbled on two fronts. First, Congress itself balked at surrendering its constitutional authority over war powers. The founders had deliberately vested that authority in the legislative branch as a check on the executive, but Ludlow's plan seemed to shift it outward in a way that lawmakers feared could tie their own hands in a moment of crisis. And second, the world changed faster than the amendment could adapt. As fascism spread in Europe and Asia, isolationism lost its magic. And by 1940, the political will to require a national war vote was gone. Supporters worried that a referendum could paralyze the nation at its moment of greatest need. Luckily, in this day and age, the threat of fascism is completely gone. Congress has full control over war powers, and it's not like any American president is using the American military like his own personal toy soldiers. Now, all this highlights why it's so important to get a great lawyer when you're dealing with your own case. Now, after I started this channel, every week I'd get hundreds of comments and emails from viewers who are dealing with legal problems, and they'd ask, can you help me find a lawyer? How do I know if this attorney is any good? And there's a massive gap in our justice system. It's that people don't know how to find the right lawyer for their specific situation. They're scared, they're overwhelmed, and they end up doing nothing or hiring the first attorney who calls them back. And that really bothered me. So I started to wonder, what if there was a different way? What if we could build a law firm that actually lived up to the values that I talk about on this channel? Transparency, accessibility, and putting clients first instead of chasing billable hours. A firm where you don't need to pay anything up front, and your lawyers only get paid if you do to maximize your opportunity for justice. So a few years ago, I decided to fix that problem. I decided to start my own personal injury law firm. And honestly, it wasn't an easy choice. But I realized I was in this unique position. I had this platform, this community, and the experience. Not to get rich, trust me, there are easier ways to make money than starting a law practice. But we did it because access to justice shouldn't be a luxury. Because finding the right legal representation shouldn't feel like playing Russian roulette with your future. And when you work with my firm, you're not just getting a lawyer. You're getting a team that understands that behind every case is a real person with real stakes. If we can't represent you or you're in a state where we don't practice, we'll take the time to try to match you with an attorney in my personal network of lawyers. A national network of some of the best lawyers in the country who actually specialize in what you're going through, located right where you are, not just whoever happens to be available. So if you're dealing with a personal injury, a car crash, a data breach, sexual harassment, a social security or workers' comp issue, give us a call at the number on screen or click on the link below. Now, I can't represent everyone that watches this channel. I wish I could, but what I can do is make sure that when you need legal help, you have somewhere to turn to that you can trust. So whether it's me handling your case or the incredible attorneys we partnered with, you'll get the same principles of honesty and education that we bring to every video. And if you're dealing with a legal issue and you're not sure where to start, check out the link in the description. Let's have a conversation about how we can help you find not just a lawyer, but the right lawyer for your situation. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is all about, making sure that when life gets complicated, you don't have to face it alone. Which is why when you need a lawyer, you don't just need a legal team, you need the Eagle team.